chapters 14 and 15 today. So far we've been reading about the relationship between Sal and her dad and Margaret, and in these chapters we're going to focus on the relationship between Sal and her grandparents. So think about how this book teaches us about relationships as we read. Alright, so let's start with chapter 14, the Rhododendron. Alright, on Saturday, I was at Phoebe's again. Her father was golfing and her mother was running errands. Mrs. Winterbottom had read out a long list to us of where she would be in case we needed her. If we heard any noises at all, we were supposed to call the police immediately. After you call the police, Mrs. Winterbottom said, call Mrs. Cadaver. I think she's home today. I'm sure she would come right over. Oh, sure, Phoebe whispered to me. That's about the last person I would call. Phoebe imagined that every noise was a lunatic sneaking in or the message leaver creeping up to drop off another anonymous note. She was so jumpy that I began to feel uneasy too. After her mother left, Phoebe said, Mrs. Cadaver works odd hours, doesn't she? Sometimes she works every night for a week, struggling home when most people are waking up, but sometimes she works during the day. She's a nurse, so I guess she works different shifts, I said. That day, Mrs. Cadaver was home, puttering around her garden. We saw her from Phoebe's bedroom window. Actually, puttering is not the best word. What she was doing was more like slogging and slashing. Mrs. Cadaver hacked branches off of trees and hauled these to the back of her lot, where she lumped them into a pile of branches that she had hacked off last week. I told you that she was as strong as an ox, Phoebe said. Next, Mrs. Cadaver slashed and sliced at a pitiful rosebush that had been trying to creep up the side of her house. Then she sheared off the tops of her hedge that borders Phoebe's yard. She moved on to a rhododendron bush, which she was poking and prodding when a car pulled into the driveway. A tall man with bushy black hair leaped out, and seeing her, he practically skipped back to where she was. They hugged each other. Oh no, Phoebe said. The man with the bushy black hair was Mr. Birkway, our English teacher. Mrs. Cadaver pointed to the rhododendron bush and then at the axe, but Mr. Birkway shook his head. He disappeared into the garage and returned with 2 shovels. He and Mrs. Cadaver gouged and prodded and tunneled around in the dirt until the poor old rhododendron flopped onto its side. They lugged the bush to the opposite side of the yard where there was a mound of dirt, and they replanted the bush. Maybe there's something hidden under that bush, Phoebe said. Like what? Like Mr. Cadaver, as I told you before. Maybe Mr. Birkway helped her chop up her husband and bury him, and maybe they were getting worried and decided to disguise the spot with the rhododendron bush. I must have looked skeptical. Phoebe said, Sal, you never can tell, and Sal, I don't think you or your father should go over there anymore. I certainly agree with her on that one. Dad and I had been there 2 nights earlier, and I had hardly been able to sit still. I started noticing all these frightening things in Margaret's house. Creepy masks, old swords, books with titles like The Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Skull and the Hatchet. Margaret cornered me in the kitchen and said, So what has your father told me about you? Nothing, I said. Oh. She seemed disappointed. My father's behavior was always different at Margaret's home. At home, I would sometimes find him sitting on his bed staring at the floor or reading through old letters or gazing at a photo album. He looked sad and lonely, but at Margaret's, he would smile and sometimes even laugh. And once she touched his hand and he let her hand rest there on top of his. I didn't like it. I didn't want my father to be sad, but at least when he was sad, I knew he was remembering my mother. So when Phoebe suggested that my father and I should not go to Margaret's, I was quite willing to agree with that notion. When Phoebe's mother came home from running all her errands, she looked terrible. She was sniffling and blowing her nose. Phoebe said that we were going to do our homework. Upstairs, I said. Maybe we should have helped her put away the groceries. She likes to do that all by herself, Phoebe said. Are you sure? Of course I'm sure, Phoebe said. I've lived here my whole life, haven't I? She looked as if she'd been crying. Maybe something is wrong. Maybe something is bothering her. Don't you think she would say so then? Maybe she's afraid to, I said. I wondered why it was so easy for me to see that Phoebe's mother was worried and miserable, but Phoebe couldn't see it. Or if she could, She was ignoring it. Maybe she didn't want to notice. Maybe it was too frightening a thing. I wondered if this was how it had been with my mother. Were there things I didn't notice? Later that afternoon, when Phoebe and I went downstairs, Mrs. Winterbottom was talking with Prudence. "Do you think I lead a tiny life?" she asked. "How do you mean?" Prudence said, as she filed her nails. "Do we have any nail polish remover?" Phoebe's mother retrieved a bottle of nail polish remover from the bathroom. "Oh," Prudence said, "before I forget, do you think you could sew up the hem to my brown skirt so I could wear it tomorrow? Oh, please." Prudence tilted her head to the side, tugged at her hair in exactly the same way Phoebe does, and smooshed up her mouth into a little pout. "Doesn't Prudence know how to sew?" I asked. "Of course she does," Phoebe said. "Why?" "I was just wondering why she doesn't sew her own skirt." "Sal, you're becoming very critical." Before I left Phoebe's that day, Mrs. Winterbottom handed Prudence her brown skirt with a newly sewn hem, and all the way home I wondered about Mrs. Winterbottom and what she meant about living a tiny life. If she didn't like all that baking and cleaning and jumping up to get bottles of nail polish remover and sewing hems, why did she do it? Why didn't she just tell them to do some of the things themselves? Maybe she was afraid there would be nothing left for her to do. There would be no need for her, and she would become invisible, and no one would notice. When I got home that day, my father handed me a package. "It's from Margaret," he said. "What is it?" "I don't know. Why don't you open it?" Inside was a blue sweater. I put it back in the box and went upstairs. My father followed me. Sal, do you like it?" "I don't want it," I said. "She was just trying to. She likes you." "I don't care if she likes me or not," I said. My father stood there looking around the room. "I want to tell you something about Margaret," he said. "Well, I don't want to hear it." I was feeling so completely ornery. When my father left the room, I could still hear my own voice saying, "I don't want to hear it." I sounded exactly like Phoebe. Chapter 15. A Snake Has a Snack. It was hotter than blazes in South Dakota. In Sioux Falls, Gramps took off his shirt. Passing Mitchell, Graham unbuttoned her dress down to her waist. Just beyond Chamberlain, Gramps took a detour to the Missouri River. He parked the car beneath a tree overlooking a sandy bank. Graham and Gramps kicked off their shoes. It was quiet and hot, hot, hot. All you could hear was a crow calling somewhere upriver and the distant sound of cars along the highway. The hot air pressed against my face, and my hair was like a hot, heavy blanket draped on my neck and back. It was so hot you could smell the heat baking on the stones and dirt along the bank. Gram pulled her dress up over her head, and Gramps undid his buckle and let his pants slide to the ground. They started kicking water at each other and scooping it up and letting it run down their faces. They walked in to where it was knee-deep and sat down. "Come on, Chickabiddy," Gramps called. Gram said, "It's delicious." I gazed up and down the river. Not a soul in sight. The water looked cool and clear. Gram and Gramps sat there in the river grinning away. I waded in and sat down. It was nearly heaven, with that cool water rippling and a high, clear sky all around us. The trees waving along the banks. My hair floated all around me. My mother's hair had been long and black like mine, but a week before she left, she cut it. My father said to me, "Don't cut yours, Sal. Please don't cut yours." My mother said, "I knew you wouldn't like it if I cut mine." My father said, "I didn't say anything about yours." "But I know what you're thinking," she said. "I loved your hair, Sugar," he said. I saved her hair. I swept it up from the kitchen floor and wrapped it in a plastic bag and hid it beneath the floorboards in my room. It was still there, along with the postcard she sent. As Gram and Gramps and I sat in the Missouri River, I tried not to think of the postcards. I tried to concentrate on the high sky and the cool water. It would have been perfect except for that ornery crow calling away. "Car, car, car." "Will we be here long?" I asked. The boy came out of nowhere. Gramps saw him first and whispered, "Get behind me, Chickabiddy." "You too," he said to Gram. The boy was about 15 or 16 with shaggy dark hair. He wore blue jeans and no shirt, and his chest was brown and muscular. In his hand he held a long bowie knife and its sheath fastened to his belt. He stood next to Gramps' pants on the bank. I thought of Phoebe and knew that if she were here, she would be warning us that the boy was a lunatic who would hack us to pieces. I was wishing we had never stopped at the river and that my grandparents would be more cautious, maybe even a little more like Phoebe, who saw danger everywhere. As the boy stared at us, Gramps said, "Howdy." The boy said, "This here is private property." Gramps looked all around. "Is it? I didn't see any signs." "It's private property." "Why, heck," Gramps said. "This here's a river. I never heard of no river being private property." The boy picked up Gramps' pants and slid his hand into a pocket. Let's see if I can get a little clearer here. "This land where I'm standing is private property." I was frightened of the boy and wanted Gramps to do something, but Gramps looked cool and calm. He sounded as if he hadn't a care in the world, but I knew that he was worried by the way he kept inching in front of me and Gram. I felt around the riverbed, pulled up a flat stone, and skimmed it across the water. The boy watched the stone, counting the skips. A snake flickered along the bank and slid into the water. "See that tree?" Gramps said. He pointed to an old willow leaning into the water near where the boy stood. "I see it," the boy said, sliding his hand into another of Gramps' pockets. Gramps said, "See that knothole? Watch what this here chickabiddy can do to a knothole." Gramps winked at me. The veins in his neck were standing out. You could practically see the blood rushing through them. I felt around the riverbed and pulled up another flat, jagged rock. I had done this a million times in the swimming hole in Bybanks. I pulled my arm back and tossed the rock straight at the tree. One edge embedded itself in a knothole. The boy stopped rummaging through Gramps' pockets and eyed me. Gram said, "Oh," and flailed at the water. She reached down, pulled up a snake, and gave Gramps a puzzled look. "It's a water moccasin, isn't it?" she said. "It's a poisonous one, isn't it?" The snake slithered and wriggled, straining toward the water. "I do believe it has had a snack out of my leg." She stared hard at Gramps. The boy stood on the bank holding Gramps' wallet. Gramps scooped up Gram and carried her out of the water. "Would you mind dropping that thing?" he said to Gram, who was still clutching the snake. To me, he said, "Get on out of there, chickabiddy." As Gramps put Gram on the riverbank, the boy came and knelt beside her. "I'm sure glad you have that knife," Gramps said, reaching for it, as he made a slit in Gram's leg across the snake bite. Blood trickled down her ankle. I grabbed Gram's hand as she stared up at the sky. Gramps knelt to suck out the wound, but the boy said, "Here, I'll do it." The boy placed his mouth against Gram's bloody leg. He sucked and spit, sucked and spit. Gram's eyelids fluttered. "Can you point us to a hospital?" Gramps said. The boy nodded as he spit. Gramps and the boy carried Gram to the car and settled her in the back seat while I snatched their clothes from the riverbank. We placed Gram's head on my lap and her feet on the boy's lap, and all the while the boy continued sucking and spitting. In between, he gave directions to the hospital. Gram held onto my hand. Gramps, still in his boxer shorts and dripping wet, carried Gram into the hospital. The boy's mouth hovered over her leg the whole time, sucking and spitting. Gram spent the night in the hospital. In the waiting room, the boy from the riverbank sprawled in a chair. I offered him a paper towel. "You've got blood on your mouth," I said. I handed him a $50 bill. "My grandfather said to give you this. That's all the cash he has right now. He said to tell you thanks. He come out himself, but he doesn't want to leave her." He looked at the $50 bill in my hand. "I don't need it." "You don't have to stay," I said. He glanced around the waiting room. "I know it." He looked away and then said, "I like your hair." I was thinking of cutting it. "Don't." I sat down beside him. He said, "It wasn't really private property." I didn't think so. Later, when I went in to see Gram, she was all tucked up in bed, pale and sleepy. Next to her, on the narrow bed, Gramps was lying on top of the covers, stroking her hair. A nurse came in and made him get off the bed. He had, by now, put his pants on, but he looked a wreck. I asked Gram how she was feeling. She blinked her eyes a few times and said, "Piddles." Gram said, "They must have given her something. She doesn't know what she's saying." I leaned down and whispered in her ear, Gram, don't leave us. Piddles, Gram said. When the nurse left the room, Gramps climbed back on top of the bed and lay down next to Gram. He patted the bed. Well, he said, this ain't our marriage bed, but it will do.